Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this webinar and panel discussion. We're here to discuss back to the office, the cyber concerns, and I'll intro the folks here. As people get into the room, let me just first say hi. If you are in the Pacific Northwest, where I am, the sun is actually out, which never happens before July 5th. But I guess today is that day. the
Climate
uh,
change.
I don't know. The coldest July 4th I ever spent was here. It was 48 degrees and raining. So, eh, there you go. July 5th is the beginning of summer. All right. So, a couple things to know is so for those of you who know us, we've been known as CI Security for a while. We just changed the name of the company to Critical Insight, which is what CI stands for. And we did it for a number of reasons. Number one is that it describes more what we provide our customers, which is critical insight into along their security journey, so they know what's happening on their network. We do both assessments and defend networks and uh, manage detection response and penetration tests. And so one of the things we found, certainly in the pandemic, is folks want multiple services from one company instead of having like 35 different vendors or 40 different vendors. And so we're leaning into the name of our MDR platform as Critical Insight. But this is not a sales presentation. I thought I should explain why it says Critical Insight for those of you who have known us as CI for a long time. On the right-hand side of the screen, where some folks are already chiming in, you can see the chat. If you have questions as this goes, please click on the chat and ask questions, and I'll make sure your questions get answered. And stay through to the end of this whole thing, because we'll have a survey, and folks who fill out the survey can either get a gift card or make a donation to a food bank. That's, again, something we started doing in the pandemic. Which now, wow, it feels like we've been in the pandemic for, Jennifer and Mike, what is it, 10 years, 11 years that we've been in the pandemic?
Geologic time.
Okay, so let me introduce who's going to be talking today. So Mike Hamilton is Critical Insight co-founder, former CISO of the city of Seattle, and Jennifer Clark. We're not saying where she works, but you can probably figure it out. She's a local information security and compliance engineer, and just an awesome speaker and expert on this topic. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mike. Mike, go for it.
Okay. So everybody is getting ready. Everybody thinks something is about to happen. Things are starting to happen. I don't think it's clear yet what's actually going to happen with, the return to the workplace. I read, I forget how long ago this was. I think it was about a year ago, that Carl Icahn had shorted commercial real estate a year ago. With the assumption that people are not going to go back to the office. A lot of people are not going to go back to the office. Well, you can see Wall Street, using whatever methodology they use, thinks 61% of workers are going to go back by September. So a little over half. Okay. People at Apple say, no, we're not going to do that. So they're pushing back on that. There was some interesting survey data done by Microsoft looking at the disconnect between how people were feeling about working from their home offices or their remote locations, and there was a wide gap between management and non-management. Management said, "Yeah, this is all going great," and non-management said, "This blows." And there are probably a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which is you're in a very undefined workspace with a lot of activity going on around it. It makes it hard to work. Indeed, employees who are remote are being targeted. There's at least one recent article on that. I think that's just a few days old. And yes, they're calling the hybrid workplace a nightmare. And so we'll touch on that a little bit. What we hope to do, go ahead to the next slide, Jake. With these few slides in the deck, we just want to go through the kind of the key points in panel and narrative form that Jennifer and I worked on when we did a paper for the Seattle InfraGard chapter. How long ago was that? 10 years?
Yep, it would coincide with that.
Beginning of
Yeah.
the pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. 10 years ago. So we have actually a white paper. And Jake, if you have it, you might throw the link in there so that everybody can get this if they want it. Because there's going to be stuff in the paper that you can use, for a reference. And all of this is going to be seasoned to taste because one size is not going to fit everybody.
And
go
just
ahead,
so everybody knows, I'm going to put the link to that in the chat. It is a PDF download link, so it will download something to your computer, which is something we like to tell people before they click on a link and say, "Oh my God, it just downloaded something to my computer." So there you go.
Yeah,
keep going, Mike.
Marketing malware. So the paper itself has got a lot of detail in it. You might want to grab that if you trust the marketing guy in his link. So first of all, depending on how big your organization is, you're going to have to do some planning around this. And we have been doing planning around this. Are you going to need to stage people coming in? If you're small enough, you can probably do everybody in a day. It's not likely for most organizations. Security is going to have to focus on this. There are going to be several other divisions in your organization that are going to have a seat at the table during the planning. I think Jennifer's got some really good thoughts on that she'll share. And you may need extra assets ready to be able to hand someone a computer while theirs is being inspected or imaged or rebuilt, re-imaged. So there's a few things to think about. And again, in the paper, there are more of these bullet points. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Jake. So, for pre-intake, things to think about are when you put something on the network, you might want to have it on a special segment of the network. And you might want to have a pre-definition of what an okay computer looks like. What kind of scan results have to come back? Are there extra DLLs lying around or something like that that need to be accounted for? Are you going to have a policy of just re-imaging everything? Likely you are not. If you're big enough, the answer is probably no. Because if you're going to do this with hundreds to thousands of computers, that just doesn't scale. Think about a risk-based way of doing this too. The exposure created by an executive who has local administrative privileges is not the same as most people working in an organization. So clearly there are some assets you're going to want to handle differently. And don't forget about things like printed materials and other company documentation, possibly secrets and intellectual property that may need to be shredded. So all of this is in scope. Go ahead, Jake. Okay. Before we started today, we had actually quite a bit of chat about this, about what are okay questions to ask that aren't going to be accusatory and aren't going to run afoul of laws, because you can't ask just any question about your space and who had access and et cetera, et cetera. And so crafting a risk intake sheet to determine how the processing is going to be done probably needs to be done in a fairly benign way, and again, in collaboration with other divisions in your company to make sure that all the questions are legal, that they're really relevant, and they don't cross over some line. So we'll talk a little bit about this, how to put together your risk-based process. And go to the next slide, Jake. And I think pretty quick here, we're out of slides, and then we're going to get to business. So yeah, here's just high risk and low risk. Here's some suggestions on how to do this. I will say that for the purpose of later forensic evaluation and or for the purpose of research, you may want to collect forensic images. And so if you do that, remember that it needs to be done the right way. There are things called data blockers, and there's specialized software that does a byte for byte copy. And will ensure that the copy is exactly the same. It involves chain of custody paperwork, et cetera, et cetera. So if you can do that, that would be a good thing to have for later, just in case something goes wrong and you may need to go back in time and look and see what happened. Think about BIOS, firmware, things like that. For low risk, run a malware scan, use a different tool than your antivirus agent. And I hope it's clear why you would use a different tool than your antivirus agent. Get rid of all cookies. Again, one size doesn't fit all. You're going to have to come up with your own process. And I think that was my last very high level overview of the contents of the paper. And now let's talk.
Well, so Jennifer, you've worked for some pretty large organizations. We can come up with the best process possible for the return to the office, the hybrid environment, whatever is going to happen in the organization, but you can't go it alone. You have to get the message out and work with other departments, and that's not easy. How do you get that to happen right?
I agree with you. And I think in full fairness and disclosure, I'll share some of my background has been actually in retail management for various companies too. So I'm a security generalist, and I try to still incorporate, the other principles of working in a corporate environment, probably differently than a purist of a cybersecurity. And so things that pet peeves that you try to make productive. You don't want to see duplication of efforts. You don't want to see inefficiencies and time wasted and costs duplicated, and just simplify things so the employee's enjoyment. But what I think that means is there are not all your IT security people, but select ones that are interested in doing this and have a skill set to navigate through the corporate environment. Go out and associate yourself with the physical security team, the HR team, perhaps even payroll. These teams historically have all been siloed off. We've grown up independently. We go to our own colleges and our own seminars and our own, conferences. And nowadays, we do need to understand each other's worlds just a little bit. Our circles overlap. So, when I'd be interviewing somebody, I can't ask them, how many children do you have? Or do you have children? Are you married? But now I have an IT security concern about who else may be accessing this laptop, or even just visually seeing or overhearing a meeting about confidential information. And so how does an IT security person accomplish their goals, but also not break rules or laws? And I think those are proactive, things that we could see these teams coordinating, but not just a one and done thing. What I would like to see and recommend is perhaps there are biweekly meetings. You touch base afterwards. Hey, what did you go to? I went to this conference. There's this new thing. We've got to do this new law. Okay, I've got to adjust accordingly. And I think that is a relationship we need to continue and start to learn and understand each other's worlds better, because it impacts all the employees.
Yeah, I'll reiterate that, because just with the process, that we're going in, the planning that we're doing here, HR is driving. HR is definitely driving this, because, they're the one that's got the biggest dog in the fight with all of the requirements for, safety, primarily opening a workspace. They're running the show.
I think benefits would be another one you might need to grab. Historically, your benefits are, when people think of that, it's compensation for your health care, perhaps, or, offsetting some T&E maybe, or something like that. But the picture could change because employees have different expectations of compensation and benefits. Now incorporating maybe a hybrid or a pure remote workstation area. But how do we adjust accordingly to be an appealing employer? And how do we make sure that we're being a cost-effective employer for our own, books?
Right. I mean, well, the last words there were cost-effective. This is an expensive undertaking.
Yeah.
What are the costs associated with essentially changing? Everybody thinks, it's not going to cost anything extra to have people work at home, or it might even be money saving, and then they come in every now and then. But there's a cost, right, Jennifer?
I think so. I think one particular one I could highlight, and I certainly can't be inclusive of everything, but I think we need to really open our eyes and think a little outside the box and look for the direct, but also the indirect. So if you take something like your compliance efforts, back in 2019, your internal audit or your regulations for PCI, for a common one we're all familiar with, you had your testing procedures for those controls, and they basically were you're testing the company's computers and the company's physical spaces and things. but that's all changed. And so now perhaps your compliance efforts are going to change their cost dynamics and their limitations, perhaps. And so I think that's an area maybe to reevaluate. You know, you're going to be able to hire that external person to go out and inspect these people's homes? Probably not. But how are you going to get to the same end
if
game?
people even let you in?
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, and that brings up another question too, right? If you do this and it's questionnaire based, you got to trust the answers.
Like a self-attestation.
Yeah, like, well, and just, I mean, questions about, has this computer connected to a public network outside the one in your home? I mean, right. I mean, that's a straightforward question, and people might be embarrassed to say, well, I wasn't supposed to, use this as Starbucks, but I did. So we're going to have to trust the veracity of the responses there. But again, I think a questionnaire should really be used to evaluate what tier of processing an asset is going to get, so that you get through this as quickly as possible, and try not to waste time on things that don't matter, and put your efforts into things that do. And I'm gonna double down as being a real fan on the forensic imaging, just in case you need to find out something later on. And there will definitely be a cost associated with that.
With the forensic imaging, yeah, absolutely.
It just
And
takes a long time. Got to have a lot of storage to stash that stuff.
I think also you bring up a point about the Starbucks comment, where HR, the softer side, if you will, can help us with those conversations, because I would hate to think I was accusatory for someone about connecting to a Starbucks network when perhaps there was this vital meeting and they just didn't want to miss it and look like a slacker, to be casual.
Yeah.
And so they were doing it with the best intent to show up. And it's a pandemic we've never been, most of us, unless we were alive in 1918, haven't been through. So, okay, come on. I was trying to give you the benefit of the doubt. You gave it up. So I think there has to be that softer side of understanding. We were all navigating uncharted territories, and, yeah, it's a bummer you did that. Let's just deal with it together. So I think that's another area that HR and some of that more human touch sides of our company can help us, because we've spent a lot of money on talent. We want to keep that retention, and we certainly don't want to rub these people the wrong way. Well, maybe their intentions, let's hope, are for the best.
So let's step back and say, Mike, I know one of the things that we dealt with, not at our company, but we helped another company deal with, is somebody brought a computer in from home.
Mm-hmm.
There was some malware sitting on it, and as soon as it was plugged into the network, it caused some serious problems. What are how does that happen? Like, what have people done in Starbucks or at home? What's happened over the last year that's causing these problems?
Well, it's a lot of things could have happened. Some of those are a little more, let's say, less likely, unless you are super important and you've been targeted, in which case, I think all bets are off. But, if you have the computer at home, have other family members used it, have, removable media that your kid uses at school got jacked into that computer, right? I mean, there's a lot of entry points there. Also, if a work device was used for lots of entertainment and lots of personal use, the work controls aren't effective, as effective when you're reading your Gmail and there's all kinds of links and bait in there and you're clicking around on that stuff, right? Because Microsoft didn't clean all that up for you. I will say too that if you are somebody like an executive in a business, or somebody that had access to financial or other information that is the object of desire of criminals, your home network security may be in scope here as well. We can't ask people, what's your home Wi-Fi password? And the internet router that connects you to Comcast or CenturyLink or Wave or whoever, those things get vulnerable. They go bad. And if you've got a bad one, and especially if it was opened up towards the internet for admin login from anywhere, maybe you try to manage your home internet stuff from other places around the world? Those are key questions, because that could be an entry point as well. So, I think it's some about the behavior and how devices were used. And some of it is about your home network security, but all those are vectors for bad things to be aggregated on a device that you are now going to come and plug into a corporate or a government network.
Yeah, and one of the things that came up in another discussion is the last year has been weird, and people might have gone to sites that they wouldn't usually go to, trying to figure out what's going on with the pandemic. They might have followed a link of social media that took them to a site.
Bait's flying around everywhere to get you to do just that.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody's gone down some conspiracy theory rabbit hole to, if they don't, whether you believe them or not, just to see what people are saying. I mean, what a weird year, right? There got to be some forgiveness for that.
Well, I think when we were writing the paper, I mean, this is a key point that Jennifer made that showed up in the paper. Not everybody knows how a computer works. And so shaming people should not be part of this at all, right? This has got to be super objective, super dispassionate, super risk-based, and staying away, like we talked about, for the questions that are actually off limits and potentially illegal, and could cause litigation. That's something I think you probably want the attorneys at the table.
Yeah, I mean, and I think I told this to Jennifer. I do have a friend who said that their boss asked for their Wi-Fi password because they wanted to prove that, they wanted them to prove that their home Wi-Fi password was not password 123. And so, Jennifer, how do you figure out what, if I have a question for the audience, actually. I'm curious, folks, put in the chat, have you asked your employees about their home environments, especially now that it's probably going to be hybrid and they go back and forth? I'm curious. Do you ask your employees about their home environments?
Or giving them guidance on what it's supposed to be?
Yeah, absolutely. And Jennifer, what questions are in scope?
Well, I was going to first address what you were talking about with the security situation and that physical one. If you contrast what most of us have done in our corporate environments, we have access key cards, we have, anti-passback systems. If you don't go through the turnstile, you won't be able to use your LAN, logons. We've implemented some pretty cool things, state-of-the-art security around these things, and we're not going to accept, okay, all bets are off. Just leave it behind your home improvement store door lock on the front door, and your dog sitter that comes in to let the dog out during the day that walks by things or something like that. So, I mean, there's a huge disparity in our previous goals of physical security and accountability to the, who's using what when. And it basically disappeared. And so I think we're going to have to reconcile that and find amicable solutions for all parties involved and realistic ones. But I don't think they're there yet. I think we're going to have some tolerance for some brainstorming and creativity in there. As far as questions to be asked, I mean, if I'm put on the spot, which, happens to most of us in our job, probably the first thing I'm going to go through is what can I not ask in an interview? Because it's probably going to be really close to that. I can't ask about childcare and if it's going to impact your work. I mean, some basic, excuse the candor, but questions that you can't ask then. So I would assume we can't ask now, even when they're an employer. And even if it's not a legal thing, it's offensive to some. There's a lot of people about equity and circumstances that they come to the workplace with. So even if it isn't something that's going to end up litigation wise, I think there also is just that human side that we need to consider, because it is a very competitive job market in information security, and keeping everyone content and retention, I think, is an important part. So I think there has to be some compassion put into this as well as following rules.
I got a question for you, Jennifer, too, because you're really a compliance expert. Are there any regulatory requirements that would stipulate actions on return? So, to my knowledge, there aren't, but I know there's a couple of people on in the audience who are DoD, CMMC, and if you were processing, what's called CUI, controlled unclassified information on a home computer, what could the ramifications be here?
Well, I think, that goes back to the concept of basic classifications versus what the private industry does versus a classified information structure, and how you deal with that. So I think they've had a lot of years of practice, but I think their decision trees is a little simpler.
Yeah. So, to the point of being binary.
Yeah.
Just no. The answer is no. You get a 0.
I think it's a little easier environment to enforce and determine. It's pretty clear cut. I think it's different in the private industry and then the gamut of the private industry, because you're small to corporation, enterprise, and global. But I think, when some of the private industry started to go to certain countries and do activities, they were trying to get in front of it with procedures for devices that had traveled afar and come back. Historically, domestically, I don't think private industry really, if you went to the conference in Chicago and came back, I don't think there's, hey, did you plug into the hotel?
Yeah, not at all.
Yeah. But I think there was already some, if information security got some traction with some of the people traveling to certain areas of the world, I think there was a little bit of like, hey, when you bring that back, or you get the disposable device when you go there. Yeah, I think it just depends on the maturity of a company that they already had. But private industry, I think, I can't think of something that's specific, unless the only way I could think of perhaps to explore would be in the financial area, that they might have something.
Yeah, the FFIEC might say something about, yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So I want to reach over into the chat here. So we asked the question.
One more, I was going to say GDPR.
Oh, yeah,
GDPR might be another one that you could poke around in.
And would that mean CCPA as well?
It would look at it's the data export, probably in import areas that we'd need to look at. Because you can't take things without certain T's crossed and not dotted to certain countries. Yeah.
So I want to reach over into the chat here. The question was, have you talked to employees about what their home environments are as they come now back and forth into the office? And we've gotten, no, yes. We leverage, somebody uses KnowBe4 for learning and testing. And of course, MFA for everything. Chris, conducts training and guidance, but doesn't ask questions. And that seems to be a theme, which is for some folks, they provide guidance. Bob says, 1-page PDFs, but without any follow-up, are those things? So question, Jennifer, without follow-up, is that effective? And for folks who haven't talked to their employees about their home environments, is it too late?
I'd say never too late, because I'm just an optimist. But I mean, you have to start somewhere. The reality is, it's just caught all of us off guard. Whatever we were thinking 3 to 5 years from the March 2020 just happened at our front door. So I think that we have to have some acceptance of the fact that there probably were oversights and mistakes and things that happened, and we've just got to clean it up. I think that's part. And your second question was, can you repeat it?
Well, so there was, is it too late? Which you said, no, it's never too late. And then the other is, if you're giving employees one-pagers,
can you check their work?
And Robert here says the KnowBe4 training directly assisted with the router password suggestions, but we don't ask about it. Should we be asking about it? Should we be saying, hey, did you follow those suggestions?
Yeah, and then you circle back to the point that we just talked about, where not everybody understands how computers work. So, what's the reading level of that document that you give to people in your spectrum of employees? If you're giving it to the IT people, maybe you can notch it up a bit. But if you're giving it to a different team, it may not be their jargon.
If you give it to the marketing team, nothing's going to happen. In fact, I
was going to say, you joke, but we just hired a new marketing team member here at Critical Insight, and within a week, she started being targeted by phishing. Yeah. I mean, she's done the security awareness training. She's done just the title, and she asked, what is going on?
Why me?
Welcome to the club.
I'm like, well, if you had to target somebody, wouldn't you target marketing? I mean, but it's a real thing.
Yeah, I think there's some, maybe customization to certain departments that we have to think about, especially if you have a diverse work. I mean, you take like a lot of companies, you may have your corporate entity and then you may have a manufacturing entity. Well, the questionnaire, are they even the same? You know,
Yeah,
you have to,
true.
I think, break up your own company within and make sure that things are applicable to the area. And then, you know, do you have an interpreter, if you will, to walk them through? But, you know, I think we also can leverage things we've been doing that seem to, you know, use the 80-20 rule, work most of the time, where, you know, annually I have to log into my security or my little employee portal thing and read a certain thing and acknowledge that I read it. And I'll do it again every year. I think for, you know, those things serve their function. I don't think they're a total flop. I'm not saying they're fail-proof either.
Yeah, I read a very interesting article. I don't know if I don't think I put this in the blast, but the article was about, can you scan your employee's home network? And there are some legal ramifications to that, and there's permission required. And you know, we're into the hybrid office now, where we're expecting, you know, people are going to be home part of that time. I know that we have engineered a home office security architecture that really works for us. Our auditors like it, et cetera, et cetera. And I think people are going to do that. But the question is, you know, checking their work. It's not a big deal to scan a perimeter if you get permission. And I think for a hybrid office going into the future, if you say, raise your hand and you say, you know, yeah, I'm going to be working at home half the time, 3/4 of the time, you know, that might be part of the cost of doing business, is you're going to let us scan your network and take a peek and make sure you don't have a vulnerable router or, you know, some other vulnerability that we can help you get patched up.
And to the point about costs, you know, and running things out, solutions are going to cost you more money or less money, but there's also ones that have more O&M. So if it's going to be, I'm just going to be simple and say, if you say, here's your home office kit, from plug this into the wall and plug this into the network, then I don't need to talk to you anymore. You're using all my stuff. Or there could be like, hey, here's your laptop, plug it into your home network, no problem. But I think when we get to these inquiries, we also have to realize that some questions can't be unasked. And so if you find out more about your employees than you wanted to know, you know, that now what do you do with
You
this?
probably did it wrong.
Right.
Well, I mean,
but,
well, I don't
you know,
know that that's, Mike, I don't know that that's true. You know, some employees just volunteer information. And so to Jennifer's point,
Well,
you know,
okay.
once you start asking, you find things out.
Well,
Yeah.
I guess my point is like, if anyone's used data loss prevention before, right? And you put your greps in for these certain things you get. Well, unfortunately, those things exist in other instances that you aren't looking for. And then you realize, I wish I never saw that, or I wish I never. So I think if we start getting too intrusive, the employers could find themselves knowing more than they wanted to, but now responsible for more than they intended.
Yeah,
So
be careful
just
what
to
you.
say,
Yeah.
play these things out, have tabletops maybe, you know, about what's my worst case scenario, what's my best.
Yeah, and by the way, I wanted to read Mark's comment here because I think it's a little long, but it's really good. Guidance
Yeah,
should
it
be in the
is.
form of written policies of home computer use that employees should be required to agree to, such as prohibition of a non-secure Wi-Fi. Even though you can't police what people do, having such policies can only help. There must be somewhere on the internet that can provide guidance on a good set of policies to start with that can be tailored to use. I actually think we wrote one up at the beginning of the pandemic, and if I can find it, I'll put it in the chat. It feels like a long time ago that this all began. But I mean, but we are at this critical moment.
By the
where,
way, we wrote it up.
Oh,
you mean?
I get it.
Oh, you mean? Oh, no, it was me right now.
It's the royal we, I think.
Yeah.
The royal we.
Yeah.
Well, I think Mark's got a good point of something we discussed earlier on one of your other sessions about acceptable use documents and agreements, you know, and they needing to revise them and look at them. And do they need different sections that never existed before for applicability? You know, it's kind of along his lines there.
Well, you know, for the hybrid stuff, and especially, you know, for our analysts, which, I mean, you know, we're opening SOC back up, but we're not going to force anybody to come work there because we have this system now. And one component of that is a device, because your comment about monitoring is a really good one. You know, in fact, this is one of the questions I would ask on, to determine how risky something is and what kind of processing level it should get. And I forgot what I was going to say. Are you monitoring the network? Are you getting events, for example, from an endpoint agent, or have you been blind to this all this time? And that the follow-on is can you monitor someone's home network, because there's other people that aren't employees on that network? And so what we did is Ubiquiti makes devices, other people do, that will segment your home network so that our employee is on a network segment. And because they're handling customer data, we're going to monitor what's going on there. I mean, this is the agreement they got to sign. And that I think is something that not enough people thought through. The monitoring aspect of it. I want to know what's going on out there. But the fact that if you're doing that and you're doing anything other than endpoint monitoring, you're getting home network traffic and you're liable to see all kinds of stuff. And that's a problem. And it's probably in violation of several statutes.
Yeah, and I want Antonio to ask a question. Can you check IP addresses on those home routers in case somebody's accessing those routers from the outside?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, using that you can, but without Ubiquiti, can you?
Well, I mean, you can check IP addresses on home routers. If somebody gives you the IP address of their home router, and you can check and see whether that's changed or not. The thing to check is the router open to the internet for login? That's what would be a problem, and combined with the password I put on my router is my dog's name, right? That is a bad combination right there. And sure, that exists out there. You see when these devices get vulnerable, people hop into the showdown machine and find them all right away and grab them. So I would think that you can check the security of that was kind of my point about doing the scanning, was to check the status of things like that. But the other good point is if you're trying to really screw down access control, those are dynamic addresses, and that makes it a little harder.
You saying FIDO-SIT is a bad password? Just kidding. Hey, so let's just assume for a second that you're going to spin up an intake process as people come back. A couple of questions. Number one is, all right, so you have a quarantine area. You have loaner devices, as you talked about. You have tools, and you do a risk rating for everything. Then what? And then I have a second part to this question. I'll get to after you answer that, Mike.
Okay. So, the things to think about, so fileless malware is a thing. You're going to want to preserve running memory if you can. And actually, it's probably not likely that they're going to bring in a running computer, but they might. So that is something to think about. If you are going to image the system, right, you have to be prepared to do the right kind of imaging, because otherwise your efforts are for nothing. Right? Chain of custody paperwork has to accompany everything. And again, this can be a great source of research later, as well as for investigation purposes. If something happens and you need to try and figure out what the root cause of it was, it'll be good to have those images around. So a risk-based process, optionally, I would say, check the device, especially if some of your users had to have local administrative privileges, like executives might. Check the device to see if it still has the same security policy you sent it off with. See if anything has been changed or dialed down. And then if your intake process, you should have, and maybe you want more than 2 tiers. I mean, Jennifer, to your point about there are different divisions in a company that have wildly different, technology needs. You may want several tiers of processing, but, on the low end, give it a good scan, wipe out all of the, the ephemeral data that it's collected, cookies and junk like that. If you're really worried about it, just do the reimage. But then if you are high risk, if you are somebody who had extraordinary access from your home to data, intellectual property, secrets, records, anything like that, treat that as higher risk and definitely image those so that you can have that, data to look at. If you can't do that imaging, you definitely want to reimage. And then I would reboot that with a sniffer on it, or put it into a quarantine network and observe it for a while. Just to make sure. Watch them after connecting, I think, is the guidance there. And there are ways to do this. You can use Active Directory quarantine to put in a little network jail so that you can still probe, scan, do things like that, but it can't arbitrarily go out to any network location. So you can see what it's trying to do there. Watch for just aberrational behavior. And that should really be the last checkbox there of the process. Didn't do anything weird, right? We went through all our steps. We observed it for a while. It's good to go. Return it to service. I will say, Mike Simon and I, probably in about a week, we're going to do a white paper on the home security architecture that we've developed for our analysts. So maybe that'll help with a little more guidance. But the intake process, right? Have all of your planning done, have your area ready, have your loaners ready, and your security team. This was another point you made when we were working on this paper too, Jennifer. Your security team needs to be focused on this, and you may need to add some capacity to that team, or to redirect from another activity while this is going on, because it's all eyes on the network. Man, if you bring something back in the network and it starts to beacon out right away, you got to smack it down.
I think I'd add to that before you go to this next question, just that this process is probably something that we're going to need to repeat. If we're going to have this hybrid, solution going on, maybe there's, annual health checks on these things, and we just keep this process repeatable. The other thing, to your point about bringing in these other people, there's the instances like your Active Directory quarantine comment in there. That's also something probably in IRT's playbook. So if your incident response team can also collaborate with this hygienic activity, they may already have some solutions to do these kind of things, but I think it's also an opportunity for collaboration and planning and tabletop within your company to say, if these things go bump in the night, how you respond in that, I think, is good practice at the very least. Don't waste a good incident.
Yeah, totally. And Jennifer, that was actually my next question. So thanks for grabbing it, which was great. Well done. Which was, hey, it's a hybrid environment, right? It's not everybody went home and now everybody comes back. It's now, you have 2 days at home, 3 days at work, or month on, month off, whatever different folks are doing. But Alan's question here is really good. And Jennifer, these are great suggestions, and in a perfect world, you do them, but it's time consuming and manually intensive. So in the real world, how do you do it?
Well, in the real world, right, and Jennifer, I'm interested in what you think too, but one size does not fit all. All of this has got to be tailored for your company, because the alternative to not doing it is accepting risk. Right? Yeah. We're just going to believe everything's cool, or maybe you just want to single out the high risk ones, and do the evaluation on them. But, executives are being targeted.
Yeah, I think so. I think, I look at whenever I'm faced with something, it's like, what have we done in the past that's similar? And what can I steal from the other guys that they've already done? And I can just, put my stuff in there. And so we always say to ourselves, don't go boil the ocean when we're trying to take on a big process. Okay, so if we use our best advice we give ourselves, then maybe we don't try that. We compartmentalize it. Maybe I have phase things. If I can't be, perfect, let's look for excellence. Let's look for a good job, and okay, so what do I really want to make sure is addressed? To your point, scans. There's some things that really are just going to be an automated technical activity. And maybe it's, hey, your first day back, but here you have a bank of banquet tables and network ports and just stick it in there. In the meantime, I'm going to feed you pizza and, cake over here or something, or we'll have some I mean, I think this all can be done in increments as well. And maybe that's what you do just to get in the first part of the door. And then within that first 30 days, maybe there's a more intensive activity. And, and then HR is maybe doing their thing. It's a Google form that comes through and people answer or something. You get that information back and it's, you just skim the top, maybe is what you can do. But doing something, even if you don't feel like you can do what the giant corporations are doing or capable of, I think it still is worth your while. But just have reasonable expectations too.
I think on the very low end, trying to make this as efficient as possible. If things came back and when they connect to the network, they are by default quarantined, right? And then if you have a help desk, they can scan that over the wire and say, okay, everything looks good, and then again though, continue to monitor and make sure that you're tooled up to look for weird aberrational types of behavior. And I don't necessarily mean just straight up beaconing out to criminal command and control. If an asset has already been compromised and it starts to like scan the network looking for SMB exposures or something like that, that could potentially be, our little eternal blue friend waking up or something like that. So, that would seem to be the lightest touch possible. You connect to the network, but you're in a quarantine state. We're going to have you looked at real well, and then we're going to open you up, but we got to watch you.
Yeah. And you could even in that opening real well could be everyone's dynamic in what they do. Maybe you're opened into next stage and then there's another scan and more intensive or a different one. And then the next stage and you progressively get back to what normal is. The other thing that may be applicable in some environments in some workplaces, an amnesty box. Just get a stack of freshly imaged computers and just drop the old stuff in, and here's a new one, and just move on. And it's what works for.
I love that, an amnesty box.
There's a chip shortage. You can't be going buying computers, man.
You can't rain on all my parade, but but that approach, may work for some. It's just dump that thing in here, and we'll just hand you a new one, or a re-imaged or recycled one if we need to for the chip shortage. But
yeah.
Yeah.
Alan's making a good point here about, and this is something we addressed in the paper too, right? Phase it coming in, right? You can't have everybody descend at once. By department might be a good way to do it.
And re-emphasized partnership, right, with HR and the executives. Who needs to come back first? Who's valuable to have that interpersonal again?
Yeah. I am curious from the audience here, for your workplaces, are you going back hybrid? Is anybody going back 100%?
Good question.
Or are you just like leaving people at home? I'm curious. Robert's saying 3 in, 2 out. While other people answer, Casey says, how do you suggest handling the hybrid working from home model? We have people that continue to work from home a couple days a week in the office and the rest of the week. So I think that question is, if you're doing it department by department, but then people are in and out, how do you, do you just create we're going to do it every quarter, or how do you, Jennifer, what do you do about that?
I love the word "it depends." I know we all appreciate that answer.
It's the consultant answer.
Yes, but it's also just, I'm not so black and white as I used to be, my college years, about things. But it really does. I think, going back, if we layer all this information that we've all collected here together, we're going to say go by department. Well, then what does hybrid mean to each of those respective departments? Is it set days? Is it Monday and Friday, or is it whenever you feel like it? And so then is there maybe some network creativity we can come up with? If you're in an area that has to do international business and communications as part of your business, then maybe you're in a network segment that has different rules than a group that should be just working on domestic activities. There's an exception to everything, but let's maybe interview these departments as we bring them back, and some open-ended questions, and let them spout out what they need. We've kind of historically done an IT one size fits all to a degree.
And by the way, I love Susie's answer here. Hybrid people have been more productive working from home. A lot of folks feel that way.
Mhm.
I also know, looking at the audience list here, that we have folks who are in for-profit business. We have nonprofits. We have public sector. We have healthcare. How does the vertical, the type of organization you're in, how does that impact your decisions here?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, it was the question about, are there absolute regulatory requirements that you need to take into consideration here, right? What kind of processing were you forced to do remotely, and what's the implication going to be in the event that, you have to explain that to an auditor? So there's
or explain it to patients, or explain it to voters, or
or
explain
exactly
it
right.
to elected leaders, right?
Yeah. But as to the hybrid question, how we handle this going forward, remember, stuff is coming back in after it's been out for more than a year. And, we really, really need to take a look at this stuff when it comes in. If somebody comes in and they're clean, well, they're probably have reasonable standards of practice that they're doing at home, right? And so I like Jennifer's idea about a quarterly check-in or something like that going forward. But
I do too.
it's gonna have to continue. It has to continue.
I think to your point, Jake, where you brought up like healthcare, for example, right? And this is going back to where there's going to have to be some customization and some procurement to those individual needs, because take HIPAA has requirements of storage and things like that. So my Amnesty solution may not be appropriate for a healthcare environment. So I think this team who's triaging the comeback will also need to consult the compliance teams to understand little things like data retention. To your point, the monitoring, logging, and auditing, for the most part, 80% of it is all the same across what you're going to be looking for. But there are some little nuances, that some industries need to record activities, or how they record the same thing is different because it comes from, an industrial control device or something like that. And it's going to come through the system differently and be stored differently. So I do think there's some specific industry items that need to be taken into account before we go gung-ho on our ideas.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple things in the chat, and also tell people we just have a couple minutes left. So if you have last questions to put them in the chat now. But and by the way, lots of agreement with working from home, less interruption, get more done.
I have to agree with Wayne in the traffic, man.
Right. Forget
The
that
big
commute,
companies
man.
haven't even come back, and it's already bad.
As
It's
companies are
awful.
opening up, traffic is getting worse.
and then-
As
Making the
people
commute
move
take
over to
longer.
Kitsap to escape Seattle, traffic is awful over here.
That's you.
Stop it.
And and Alan says, there's the potential discussion about the company supplying a router for the employee, and
Yeah.
Eric saying, yeah, we've done that with a Meraki router and site-to-site VPN. So people have found solutions there.
Mhm.
And
But a site-to-site VPN is an encrypted tunnel, but it's an open tunnel. And if that endpoint gets hosed, it's going to swim straight upstream because you just gave it a tunnel. I actually like the brokered remote access, right, through a Citrix mechanism or something like that, to where you're not actually connected to an asset inside the network.
Mhm.
And I'll point out too that putting everything in the cloud kind of negates a lot of this, right? If what you're accessing is Office 365 and S3 storage and things like that, rather than stuff that's in your data center at work, that's a consideration as well.
I think it made, and I totally agree with you on board. I mean, one over the other. I think some of the dynamics I was even faced with, between my laptop and my phone, and loading an app to do something that I was doing on a provisioned device. Again, this got down to, especially in the beginning of this, I think a lot of us found being scrappy, if you will, to get the job done we were expected to do, because the adjustments hadn't started yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have to be realists and go back and look at that kind of information, going back to that acceptable use thing. And, if we're going to be hybrid, going to be mobile, then people are going to be different places.
yeah.
That's a really good suggestion. I'm just gonna take a look at the old AUP.
And Mike, while you do that,
Mhm.
I always feel good when I get him to write notes.
So and while you do that,
I'm getting the best end of the deal here, man.
Yeah. One of the things that, that Jennifer, you mentioned is, audits, if you're auditing, things have changed, if you think, what your network, was touching, more than a year and a half ago, everything's changed. One of the things that we started doing, that Critical Insight started doing, was sort of light assessments that we're calling 13-point assessments. And it's just a way to take a look at, it's a 1-hour assessment. And because of all of the recent ransomware stuff, one of our customers suggested doing it at no cost for a period of time. If folks are interested in spending an hour on the phone with one of our strategists and just doing a quick assessment of where you are, shoot me an email. It's just jake@criticalinsight.com. You can try my new email address. You might be the first one. And I'll put it in the chat there. And we can set you up with one of those 13-point assessments. I'm also in the chat going to put in the survey, and please fill it out. There's also a place in the survey where you can ask for a 13-point assessment if that's helpful. And while I put that in there, final thoughts. Jennifer, what are your final thoughts here?
I guess just approach this with a positive attitude, and keep your head up, because I think it's going to be frustrating. I think people are going to hate us like they sometimes do in information security. But I think if we can approach this with just optimism and realize we're all in this together, which I know sounds like a cliche thing you see on the side of the road, but it really is. And I think we just need to come in with some compassion for each other as we go and muddle through this and listen to each other's professional, backgrounds and our contributions. I think everyone's is going to be valuable in this, and we need to have open ears.
Mike, before you give your final thoughts, Zach says, did I find the work from home policy document you guys, Mike, created? I'll go look for it. I haven't looked for it because I've been here with you, but if I find it, if you're interested in that, email me and I'll see if I can find that one. Mike, final thoughts.
So first of all, I want to agree with everything Jennifer says.
Okay, that's reciprocated.
Yeah, well, I will say too that, we're raising the flag about bad things that can happen when computers come back in from the field after being specifically on a home network in an unknown, state with, we don't know who else is in, proximity, et cetera, et cetera. So all these are unknowns. Whether or not something actually happens, we're waiting to see. This stuff will get a whole lot more real, and this process a whole lot more important if indeed it starts to happen, that people are bringing in, assets that they had at home and they've been popped, and, bad guys were waiting to see the corporate network, and then, everybody gets cybered. That's still somewhat theoretical prognostication because it has not been observed empirically. If it does, everybody's going to be on this bandwagon for, the whole intake process and taking this very seriously. Yeah, because we manage things by landmine. That's how we do it.
We try not to. But
I need a shirt for that, or a bumper sticker.
This was my. So apologies to public sector people, but this is what I said about government when I worked in it.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. Please take the survey in the chat. A couple of reasons. One, we want to know how we did. We want to know if we should keep doing these things. We want to know also, how we can help you. And there's a chance in the survey where you can get a gift card or sign up to donate that gift card to a food bank. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us for this one. We always love having you.
You're welcome.
And for dealing with Mike to write that paper together.
It was my pleasure.
And Mike, as always, thank you. And I'm getting a lot of emails about that work from home document, so I'm going to have to go find it now. All right.
Joe might have the most recent copy of that.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you very much and have an awesome day.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you, Jennifer.
See you later.